She was 20 years old when her uncle stood in the doorway of the only home she had ever known and told her she had until sundown to be gone. Silas Colby was her father's brother, and he had come from Omaha within a week of the funeral, papers in hand, to claim the farm as payment against debts her father had never spoken of. What Margaret Colby had left in the whole world after that was $11 sewn into the hem of her traveling skirt, her mother's sewing basket, and a stubborn refusal to beg. So when the county auctioneer, 3 days later, called out a parcel that made the crowd in Willow Bend laugh out loud, a flooded, collapsed root cellar on the old Pruitt homestead, its timbers rotted, its floor standing in black water, Margaret raised her hand and bought it for $6. "It's worthless," the auctioneer said, shaking his head as he took her money. She only nodded because she had learned, in 20 years of watching her father coax life from poor soil, that worthless was a word men used for things they had not troubled themselves to look at closely. She did not yet know that sealed inside that ruined cellar, wrapped in oilcloth and locked inside a rusted tin box, was a dead woman's diary, and that its pages would unravel a debt owed to an entire town, a debt that had been waiting 11 years to be paid. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Margaret Colby. If you are watching this from a town that other people forgot, or from a home that someone once told you wasn't worth saving, we would love to hear about it in the comments below. And if stories like Margaret's mean something to you, consider following or subscribing, because we have many more waiting to be told. Margaret Colby had been born in the spring of 1867 on a modest wheat farm 4 miles outside of Willow Bend, a rail-siding town in the Nebraska Territory that had grown up around a grain depot and a church with a crooked steeple. Her father, Thomas Colby, was a quiet, careful man who believed that the land gave back exactly what was put into it, no more and no less, and he raised his only daughter to believe the same. Margaret's mother, Ruth, had died of a fever when Margaret was 9, and from that year forward the girl had kept house, kept accounts, and kept her father company through the long Nebraska winters, learning things that most young women of her station were never taught: how to read a ledger, how to judge the health of soil by its smell after rain, how to mend a harness, how to barter fairly and firmly, and how to hold her tongue in front of men who expected her to lower her eyes. Thomas never apologized for teaching her these things. "A woman who understands her own worth," he told her once, mending a fence post in the blue hour before dawn, "cannot be cheated near so easily as one who has been taught to doubt it." Margaret carried that sentence with her the way other girls carried lockets. She grew into a young woman known through the county for her steadiness rather than her softness. She was the one neighbors sent for when a foal came breech, or when a widow's roof needed patching before the first snow, or when the church ladies needed someone with a clear hand to keep the charity accounts honest. She was not unloved, exactly, but she was not indulged either. She had learned early that comfort was a luxury the prairie rarely extended twice to the same family. Her father's health began to fail her 17th winter, a cough that settled into his chest and never fully left, and Margaret nursed him through 2 more harvests with a patience that surprised even the women who had known her since childhood. In those years, she also began quietly keeping her father's books herself, because his hand shook too badly to hold a pen steady, and in doing so she learned something her father never told her plainly: that the farm carried debts. Small ones at first, incurred during a drought year, then larger ones, borrowed against future harvests that never quite arrived large enough to satisfy them. Thomas Colby was too proud, or too frightened, to speak of this to his daughter directly, and so when he died in the autumn of 1886, 2 months past Margaret's 19th birthday, she inherited not only his grief, but a debt she did not fully understand, owed in part to a bank in Omaha, and in part, as she would soon discover, to her own uncle. Margaret's world, in those years, was a small one measured mostly in seasons and in the particular textures of labor, the cold bite of well water in the early morning, the smell of bread rising in a kitchen that still bore her mother's careful arrangement of pots and jars, the long, companionable silences she and her father shared while mending fence or shelling corn on the porch as the light went gold and then gray. She had few close friends her own age, not because the town disliked her, but because she had never quite fit the rhythm of parlor visits and courting talk that occupied the other young women of Willow Bend. She preferred the company of her father's ledgers and the small, satisfying certainty of a debt properly recorded, a seam properly sewn, a fence properly mended. There had been, briefly, a young man from a neighboring farm who called on her twice one autumn before deciding, as he told a mutual friend, that Margaret Colby was too much her own woman for easy company, and Margaret had felt no great sorrow at his absence afterward. Only a quiet confirmation of something she already suspected about herself, that she was building toward a life that did not require another person's permission to feel complete. Thomas had one living brother, Silas Colby, a man who had left Nebraska Territory as a young man to make his fortune in freight and land speculation in Omaha, and who returned to Willow Bend only for funerals. Silas was not, by the town's estimation, a wicked man in any obvious way. He did not drink to excess. He did not raise his voice. He wore a fine coat and spoke softly, and always paid his respects at the proper moments. But Margaret had noticed, even as a girl, the particular way her uncle's eyes moved across a room, cataloging value the way other men might admire a sunset, the acreage, the timber stand, the good well. She did not yet know, in the weeks after her father's death, that Silas held a note against the farm, a private loan he had extended to Thomas 3 years earlier during the drought, one Thomas had never recorded plainly in his own books out of shame, and one that Silas had quietly allowed to accrue interest while he waited, patiently, for the day it would come due. That day, as it happened, arrived precisely 1 week after Thomas Colby was laid in the ground. The fall came swiftly, and without much ceremony, the way Margaret would later say true ruin always does, not with thunder, but with paperwork. Silas Colby arrived in Willow Bend on a gray October morning, dressed for travel rather than mourning, and asked to see Margaret in the front room, where her father's chair still held the shape of him. He laid out his documents on the table with the calm efficiency of a man closing a routine transaction. The note, the accrued interest, a deed of transfer already drawn up by an Omaha lawyer, needing only Margaret's signature to formalize what Silas insisted the law already permitted him to take regardless. He was not cruel in his manner. He even offered, with what he seemed to consider generosity, to let her keep her mother's sewing basket and whatever clothing she could carry. The land was never truly going to be yours to keep, Margaret, he told her, not unkindly folding his gloves. A farm needs a man's hand on it, and yours were never going to be enough. It's simply arithmetic. Margaret did not cry in front of him, though she wanted to. She had learned that tears in front of Silas Colby would only confirm whatever quiet judgment he had already made about her capabilities. She signed nothing that day, but the county clerk's office, when she visited it 2 mornings later, with her father's ledgers under her arm, confirmed what she already feared. The note was real, properly recorded, and Silas's claim, however coldly delivered, was lawful. She was given until the end of the week to vacate the only home she had ever known. The days between her uncle's visit and her departure passed in a strange, muffled quiet, the kind Margaret would later say felt less like grief and more like holding one's breath under water. waiting for the moment air would be necessary again. She walked through each room of the farmhouse slowly, memorizing the particular slant of afternoon light across the kitchen floorboards, the exact creak of the third stair, the faded pencil marks on the pantry doorframe where her father had once measured her height each spring, as though committing a room to memory might somehow preserve a claim on it that no lawyer's paper could erase. Neighbors came by in those final days, several of them quietly furious on her behalf. One older farmwife pressing a jar of preserves into her hands and murmuring that Silas Colby had always been a man who mistook patience for virtue, when it was really only appetite wearing a slower face. But sympathy, however sincerely offered, changed nothing in the county clerk's ledger. And on the appointed morning, Margaret rose before dawn, dressed in her plainest traveling clothes, and packed what little the law and her uncle's grudging generosity allowed her to keep. She left with what her uncle allowed and what fit into one trunk and one traveling bag, her mother's sewing basket, 2 dresses, her father's pocket watch, a small collection of books, and $11 that she had managed to keep hidden from Silas's accounting, money saved slowly over 3 years from selling preserves and mended linens at the county fair. Money her uncle did not know existed because she had never once let him see the full shape of her. She took a room above the Mercantile in Willow Bend for 50 cents a week, paid in advance, and she told herself, lying awake that first night listening to strangers' footsteps on the stairs below, that $11 and her own 2 hands would have to be enough, because they were all she had left. It was in that narrow room, 3 days later, reading a notice pinned to the board outside the courthouse announcing a county land auction for parcels forfeited on unpaid taxes, that she first saw the listing for the old Pruitt homestead, abandoned 9 years. The house long since collapsed and scavenged for lumber, the well fouled, and the root cellar, the notice specified almost as an afterthought, flooded and considered a total loss. The auction itself took place on the courthouse steps on a bright, cold morning in November, and Margaret stood at the edge of the small crowd of speculators and farmers in her plainest dress, counting her coins in her mind before she ever raised her hand. Most of the Pruitt land had already sold in the first hour, bought up cheaply by men looking to add acreage to existing spreads, none of them interested in the low, waterlogged corner of the property where the old root cellar sat half-collapsed into the earth like a wound that had never properly healed. When the auctioneer finally reached that parcel, half an acre, cellar included, deemed unfit for building or planting, the crowd actually laughed. And one man called out that the county ought to pay someone to haul the rubble away rather than sell it. It's worthless, the auctioneer agreed. More to move the sale along than out of any real conviction, and he named an opening price of $2, simply to have a number on the record. Margaret raised her hand before she had entirely decided to. Something about the laughter, about the easy dismissal of a piece of earth, simply because it did not present its worth plainly to men in a hurry, struck a nerve her father had spent years cultivating in her. She bid $2, then $4, when a young man half-heartedly bid against her more from surprise than interest, and finally closed the sale at $6 even, the auctioneer shrugging as he took her coin and marked the ledger, clearly certain he had just taken money from a girl too proud or too foolish to know a bad bargain when she made one. She walked out to the parcel that same afternoon, alone, because she owned nothing else in the world now, and felt she owed it to herself to see exactly what her $6 had purchased. The old Pruitt house was gone entirely, nothing left but a scorched foundation stone and a lilac bush gone wild. But the root cellar remained, sunk into a low rise behind where the kitchen must once have stood, its wooden door hanging from one hinge and black water standing ankle-deep just inside the threshold. The air that came up from it smelled of clay and old rot, and Margaret stood at the entrance for a long moment, listening to the particular silence of a place long since given up on, before she rolled her sleeves and went in anyway. Because $6, foolish or not, was $6 she intended to see the value of. It took her the better part of 2 weeks, working most afternoons after she'd finished piecework sewing for the mercantile owner's wife to cover her room, to bail the standing water from the cellar bucket by bucket, and to clear the collapsed shelving and rotted barrel staves that choked its narrow space. She found little of value in that first stretch of labor beyond the cellar's bones themselves, which she noted with some satisfaction were sounder than anyone had bothered to check. Stone-lined walls, dug deep and true into a natural clay shelf that had kept the space cooler and drier at its rear than the flooding at the entrance would have suggested. It was in that drier rear corner, prying loose a warped shelf-board that had swollen against the stone, that her fingers struck something that did not belong to wood or rock at all. A small recess chiseled directly into the clay-packed wall behind the shelving, deliberately hollowed and just large enough to hold a tin box no bigger than a Bible, wrapped first in what had once been oilcloth and tied twice over with waxed cord that had somehow held against 9 years of damp. Margaret sat back on her heels in the cold, filtered light coming through the broken door, and understood, with the particular clarity that comes to people who have learned to notice what others overlook, that someone had hidden this deliberately, and had hidden it well, and had likely never come back for it. She did not open the tin box there in the cellar. She carried it back to her narrow room above the mercantile, set it on the small table by the window, and sat looking at it for a long while before she worked the rusted clasp loose with a hairpin, because some part of her already sensed that whatever was inside would not be a small thing. Inside, still remarkably dry within its careful wrapping, she found a woman's diary bound in worn brown leather, its pages filled front to back in a small, careful hand, along with a folded packet of documents tied with ribbon and a single tintype photograph of a young woman with serious eyes standing beside a man Margaret did not recognize. The diary's first page bore a name written in the same careful hand, Eleanor Pruitt, 1876. Margaret read late into that first night by lamplight, and what she found unfolded slowly, the way true stories often do, revealing themselves in fragments rather than all at once. Eleanor Pruitt, she learned, had been the wife of Josiah Pruitt, one of the earliest settlers of the Willow Bend Valley, and the diary began ordinarily enough with the small chronicle of a young farm wife's days, planting, weather, the births and losses common to that life. But as the entries progressed through 1876 and into 1877, a different thread emerged, one Eleanor wrote about with growing unease. Josiah Pruitt, it seemed, had discovered a natural spring on a rise of land at the edge of his own property. A strong, clean, year-round source of water in a valley that suffered droughts nearly every third summer. And rather than share news of it with the small community of struggling homesteaders around him, Josiah had begun quietly buying up the water rights and adjoining parcels from his neighbors, using a man named Aldous Vane, a land agent from the county seat, to make the purchases under Vane's name rather than his own, so that no one would understand the pattern forming until it was too late. Eleanor's entries grew darker and more troubled as she wrote of her husband's plan, he intended, once he controlled every parcel touching that spring, to dam and channel its flow entirely onto his own land, then sell water access back to the very neighbors he had quietly dispossessed of their fair share, at whatever price the coming droughts would allow him to name. Eleanor had begged him to reconsider, writing that a community's water belonged to no single man's ledger. But Josiah would not be moved, and in an entry dated late in the summer of 1877, Eleanor wrote with what Margaret could only read as quiet despair that she had begun making her own copies of Aldous Vane's purchase agreements and the true, unrecorded deed to the spring parcel itself, which Josiah had never dared file publicly for fear of drawing attention to how much land he had accumulated under another man's name. She intended, the entry said, to see the documents into honest hands the moment she found the courage or the opportunity. That opportunity, the remaining pages made devastatingly clear, never came. The diary ended abruptly in the autumn of 1877. Mid-sentence in places, the final entries growing shorter and more anxious, mentioning a fever moving through the valley and Josiah's refusal to send for a doctor from town in time. County records that Margaret would later confirm at the courthouse showed that Eleanor Pruitt had died that November, and that Josiah Pruitt himself had died less than 2 years later, the homestead falling into disrepair and eventual abandonment, the land reverting to the county for unpaid taxes nearly a decade later, the very parcel Margaret had just purchased for $6. But the spring itself, and the water rights Eleanor had documented, Margaret discovered upon closer examination of the folded papers, had never reverted with the rest of the estate. They remained, according to Eleanor's careful copies, still recorded under the name of Aldous Vane, the land agent, a name Margaret recognized immediately, with a cold shock that settled through her whole body. Because Aldous Vane's grandson, Harlan Vane, was the very man who currently controlled Willow Bend's only water company, charging the town and its outlying farms a steadily rising fee for access to what everyone in the valley believed was simply the natural course of Miller's Creek. Margaret understood, sitting alone in her lamplit room with a dead woman's handwriting spread across her table, that Eleanor Pruitt had uncovered a fraud that had never been undone. It had simply changed hands, quietly, generation to generation, disguised as inheritance. Margaret spent the following weeks moving carefully, aware that what she now knew was dangerous precisely because it threatened a family that had spent 40 years positioning itself as Willow Bend's benefactor rather than its quiet toll collector. She confirmed, through patient afternoons at the county recorder's office, where the elderly clerk, Mr. Adler, had known her father and was willing to indulge her questions, that the original spring parcel and its attached water rights had indeed been transferred from Aldous Vane's estate to his son and then to Harlan Vane through 3 generations of inheritance, never once appearing for public sale, and that the underlying claim rested entirely on purchase agreements Mr. Adler could find no original signed copies of in the county's own files, only Aldous Vane's later sworn statements of ownership, filed years after Eleanor's death, when there was no one left to contradict him. Margaret began to understand that Eleanor's careful copies, hidden in that tin box, were very likely the only surviving evidence that the water rights underlying Harlan Vane's entire company had been assembled through deliberate deception of the very neighbors who had trusted Aldous Vane as a fair and independent land agent. She was not naive about what this discovery meant for her personally, nor about the risk of confronting a man as established and comfortable as Harlan Vane, but she also could not set the diary aside once she had read it, because she recognized in Eleanor Pruitt's careful, frightened handwriting something of her own recent circumstance. A woman who had seen clearly what was being taken from people too trusting or too occupied with survival to notice, and who had tried, in whatever small way was available to her, to make it right before her own time ran out. She thought often, in the days that followed, of the tintype photograph tucked among Eleanor's papers, the young woman with serious eyes standing beside a husband whose ambitions would ultimately outlast her. And Margaret found herself returning to that image the way one returns to a grave. Not out of morbidity, but out of a quiet, private vow. Margaret decided, sitting once more in her narrow room with the tin box open before her, that she would finish what Eleanor Pruitt had not lived long enough to do. Willow Bend, when Margaret first began asking careful questions around town about the history of the water company, did not receive her inquiries warmly. Harlan Vane was, by every outward measure, a pillar of the community. He had funded the new schoolhouse roof 2 winters prior, sat on the church building committee, and was widely regarded as a shrewd but fair businessman who had simply inherited a valuable asset and managed it responsibly. Several of the townsfolk Margaret spoke with, including people who privately grumbled about the rising cost of water access each summer, nonetheless warned her plainly against making accusations she could not prove against a man of Vane's standing, particularly as she herself was, in the eyes of many in Willow Bend, little more than a dispossessed farm girl with a grudge against her own family, and, some now assumed, against prosperous men generally. Word reached Harlan Vane himself within a week that Margaret Colby had been asking questions at the county recorder's office about old land transfers connected to his water company. And he came to find her directly, arriving at the Mercantile one afternoon with the same soft, unhurried courtesy Margaret recognized uncomfortably from her uncle Silas, the manner of a man entirely unaccustomed to being questioned. Margaret received him in the small parlor behind the Mercantile that the owner's wife still occasionally allowed her to use, and she noted, with the same careful attention her father had taught her to bring to a ledger, every detail of Harlan Vane's bearing, the unhurried way he removed his hat, the practiced warmth of his greeting, the manner in which his gaze moved briefly but thoroughly over the room, cataloging her circumstances the way a buyer might assess a horse before naming a price. He was, in that first meeting, neither threatening nor unkind, which Margaret would later understand was its own kind of danger. He spoke warmly of her father, expressed sympathy for her recent losses, and gently suggested that a young woman recently made destitute might find herself, quite understandably, susceptible to seeing conspiracy in what was simply the ordinary, lawful accumulation of property that any successful family managed across generations. He offered, with what he clearly considered great generosity, to pay Margaret a modest sum, $50, more money than she had seen in one place in her entire life, for the tin box and its contents, framing it as an act of charity toward a girl who deserved a fresh start rather than a fixation on old, painful history that could serve no one. When Margaret declined, politely but firmly, Harlan Vane's courtesy did not crack, but something behind his eyes went cold and calculating in a way that reminded her, again unmistakably, of her uncle. Within days, the Mercantile owner's wife quietly informed Margaret that she would no longer be needing her piecework sewing, an explanation offered with visible discomfort, and no real reason given. Her landlady raised her weekly rent without warning. A county official Margaret had never met suggested to Mr. Adler, in passing, that perhaps records requests from unaffiliated townspeople ought to require a small administrative fee going forward. None of it was dramatic. All of it was arithmetic, precisely the word Silas Colby had once used against her, and Margaret understood that Harlan Vane intended to starve her into silence with the same patient, bloodless efficiency his grandfather had once used to strip an entire valley of its rightful water. It was in this narrowing circumstance, with her savings dwindling and her few remaining allies in town growing quietly afraid to be seen with her, that Margaret made the decision that would define everything that followed, rather than confront Harlan Vane alone, where her word would forever stand against his standing. She brought Eleanor Pruitt's diary and documents to the one person in Willow Bend whose authority even Harlan Vane could not easily dismiss or intimidate, Judge Anselm Whitcomb, the circuit judge who rode through the county twice yearly to hear disputed claims, a man known through the territory for a stern, old-fashioned insistence on documentary proof over reputation. Margaret laid out Eleanor's diary, the copied purchase agreements, and the unfiled original deed before the judge in his temporary chambers at the courthouse, walking him patiently through the timeline exactly as Eleanor herself had recorded it, and watched as the old judge's expression shifted from polite skepticism to genuine, grim attention as he examined the handwriting, the dates, and the internal consistency of a dead woman's careful, frightened testimony, written a decade before Margaret herself had been born. The formal hearing, when Judge Whitcomb called it 3 weeks later, drew nearly the entire town of Willow Bend into the small courthouse, farmers and merchants and their wives crowding the benches and the doorway to hear evidence that a portion of the water they had been paying steadily rising fees for had never rightfully belonged to the Vane family at all. Harlan Vane arrived with his own attorney and an air of wounded confidence that never fully left his face even as the judge, methodically and without theater, walked through Eleanor Pruitt's documents alongside the county's own incomplete records, exposing the absence of any original signed agreement, the suspicious timing of Aldous Vane's sworn ownership statements, filed only after Eleanor's death, and the pattern of quiet parcel acquisitions that matched, point for point, what Eleanor had recorded in fear a decade prior. The courthouse that day was crowded past its usual capacity, farmers standing shoulder to shoulder along the back wall, and children peering through the tall windows from outside, and Margaret felt the particular weight of so many watching eyes settle on her as she rose to take her place before the judge's bench. She had rehearsed nothing, because she had learned from her father that a true account needed no rehearsal, only care, and so she spoke slowly and clearly, describing the flooded cellar, the hollow chiseled into the clay wall, the careful oilcloth wrapping that had kept a decade of damp from ruining a dead woman's testimony. Several older townsfolk in the gallery, Margaret would later learn, had known Eleanor Pruitt personally in their own girlhoods, and more than one wiped at her eyes as portions of the diary were read aloud, recognizing in Eleanor's frightened, careful sentences a woman they remembered only vaguely as quiet and unwell before her early death. Never once suspecting the burden she had been carrying alone, Margaret herself was called to testify, and she spoke plainly, without embellishment, describing exactly how she had found the tin box, and letting Eleanor's own words, read aloud into the record, carry the weight of the accusation rather than her own. Judge Whitcomb's ruling, delivered 2 days later after reviewing the full record, found that the original spring parcel's water rights had indeed been fraudulently obscured through the false use of an intermediary agent's name. And while he stopped short of criminal charges against a third-generation inheritor who could plausibly claim ignorance of his grandfather's original deception, he ordered the water rights returned to public trust, to be held and administered by a town water board rather than any single family, with fee structures set by that board rather than by private profit. Harlan Vane, stripped in a single afternoon of the quiet leverage his family had held over Willow Bend for 40 years, did not go to prison and did not lose his home. But he lost the one thing his family had always relied upon most, the town's unquestioning trust, and within the year unable to bear the weight of neighbors who now greeted him with cool, careful politeness rather than deference. He sold his remaining property and left the valley altogether. His family's long, quiet toll on Willow Bend finally, definitively ended. Margaret was offered, in the weeks following the ruling, a modest finder's portion from the newly formed town water board in recognition of what her discovery had returned to the community, along with genuine, warm gratitude from neighbors who had once laughed at her for buying a flooded cellar for $6. She used a portion of that money, together with what remained of her own savings, not to build herself a grand house or to buy back her father's farm from a distant buyer, but to properly restore the old Pruitt root cellar itself, clearing it fully, shoring its stone walls, and building above it a modest, sound cabin on the half-acre she still owned outright. The only piece of ground in the entire valley that belonged to her free and clear, purchased with her own hands and no one else's mercy. She often told anyone who asked that she had not set out to expose a fraud or restore a town's water rights. She had only refused to accept a man's word that something was worthless simply because he had not troubled himself to look closely at it. And everything that followed had grown naturally from that single, stubborn refusal. And so we return, as we so often do, to where this story began, to a 20-year-old woman standing alone on a courthouse step, counting $6 into an auctioneer's palm, while a crowd of grown men laughed at her foolishness. Margaret Colby was not foolish. She was, as her father had raised her to be, a woman who understood that value is rarely announced plainly to the world. It waits, often in flooded cellars and locked tin boxes, and the careful, frightened handwriting of women history nearly forgot, for someone patient enough and brave enough to go looking. What Eleanor Pruitt could not finish in her own short life, Margaret Colby carried forward and completed, not for wealth and not for vengeance against the family that had once cast her aside, but because a debt of honesty had been owed to an entire valley for nearly 40 years, and someone, finally, was willing to pay it. That is the quiet, enduring shape of restoration. Not thunder, not spectacle, but one determined woman refusing to let a good and honest voice go unheard, simply because it had been buried a little too deep for lazier hands to find. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Margaret Colby's story. If it moved you, we would be so grateful if you would share it with someone who might need to hear it today. And we would love to know, in the comments below, what is a time in your own life when you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? We read every one of your stories, and they mean more to us than you know. Until next time, stay close.